absolute failure. Absolute failure. I just got out of a closed-door meeting with the APC, the Alliance for Pharmacy Compounders, or compounding. And it had the CEO, Scott Brunner. It had 3 pharmacists around the country representing both 503A and 503B. And it was myself and a group of like real reporters like Bloomberg Magazine, Wired, like the caliber was top notch. I'm pretty sure that I was the only user and social media creator in that room. And I'm glad that I was there and I got to ask additional questions because this drug matters to me. Having access matters to me and my friends. Having some kind of warning and having a plan matters to me and my friends. And all of the subscribers and people that follow this and all my other platforms. This matters to us. So I am inherently, this is not just a story. This is my life. So I'm going to break this into series because there's a bunch of different subject matters that are equally infuriating. And then some of them are clarifying. But let's play a little game today called Put a Finger Down. You ready? Put a finger down if the FDA doesn't have a clear rules and guidelines of how a drug goes on and off of shortage. With the hundreds and thousands of Americans that have been on and off of Tirzepatide throughout the 2 years that it's been on the market, and what a blockbuster drug it is that we keep hearing spread all over the headlines, that the FDA had no plan for transition of care.
3 or so months ago, I informally reached out to FDA to raise this issue. We had concerns about transition of care.
Put a finger down if the FDA allows the 503B pharmacies to sell to the 503A pharmacies their API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, which is Tirzepatide, allows them to sell to the 503A pharmacies, but the second the shortage ends, even though it was bought under 503B, the rules are unclear whether the 503A can distribute the product that they bought on the 503B.
Because the B prepared the drug, but she's dispensing them. And that is abundantly unclear.
Put a finger down. If the FDA relies solely on the information provided by Eli Lilly to determine whether the shortage is over, they don't go by distributors, suppliers, wholesalers, doctors, patients, pharmacies, solely on the information by big pharma, multi-billion-dollar, speculated to be worth over $1 trillion, the most blockbuster, most profitable drug probably in our lifetimes. Put a finger down if the only person that tells them that it's out of shortage is Eli Lilly.
Did we touch base too on the fact that we really feel that FDA to remove the drug from the shortage list only takes into account what the manufacturer is telling them?
I'm going to play for you the actual meeting of the people, the pharmacists and Scott Brunner, so you can hear it from yourselves. It's a great meeting. The APC is great. If you remember Scott was, do you guys remember like in June when Eli Lilly sent out that press release, trying to do scare tactics public where do you remember it? Like, they were like, oh, you can't trust these off-label generic wannabe Mounjaros. We are the only legal manufacturer of Mounjaro, and we don't know what they're adding to it. Like, I don't know, just some pink stuff. Like, they didn't know that people were putting vitamin B12 in there, and they played stupid, and they sent all the cease and desist letters out. Do you guys remember that? Well, Scott Brunner was that guy that we all celebrated for a minute because he wrote the letter responding to Eli Lilly and basically saying, like, compounding is safe and legal under the statutes of the 503A, 503B, and we're legally allowed to do so while it's on shortage. And we all cheered him on for a little bit. Well, it's that guy, which is really freaking amazing that I got to, be in a virtual room with that guy. So anyways, it was really, really cool being there. Listen to this.
Did we touch base too on the fact that we really feel that FDA to remove the drug from the shortage list only takes into account what the manufacturer is telling them?
The moment that FDA marked Tirzepatide injection as resolved on the shortage list, 503A pharmacies, traditional compounding pharmacies, had to cease immediately preparing that drug in what FDA determines as inordinate amounts. FDA guidance says inordinate amounts is any more than 4 a month. That may seem a little arbitrary, but that's what the guidance says. So they had to stop immediately. 503B outsourcing facilities have in guidance a 60-day window in which they can continue to distribute the drugs. We have real questions about how that pertains in this situation with such a blockbuster shortage drug. And we've asked FDA for answers to those questions and are awaiting that response. Sources. The current statute only allows them to consider data from drug makers. And we believe they ought to be able to pull from hospital, from health systems, from pharmacies. Certainly, these folks are on the front lines. If there is a shortage coming, they're going to be among the first to see it. And yet, FDA is somewhat bound by the law now that only allows them to draw from manufacturers.
Something comes off a shortage coming from the FDA, I at least expect to be able to get product and service our patients. And over this last week, concerns have grown from providers, from patients. They've kind of left holding the bag. And what I say is my team has gone from pharmacists to therapists.
I said, you just got to keep making it. And I'm like, dude, no, that's not how this works.
Jen, are you serious? You've used your personal credit cards to try to cover the cost of these drugs so that you can serve these patients?
Well, most of my credit cards are personal, in my personal name, even though they're for the business. And so, yes, that's how that works.
With Arthur's question here, which, sounds like the first step in like what preparation did compounders give patients for this inevitable step by FDA? Was there information given to them in advance, I assume to the patients, to have a warning that they would face an immediate cutoff of the compounded drug when it came off of shortage?
Yeah, let's talk about our interactions with FDA. A few months ago, 3 or so months ago, I informally reached out to FDA to raise this issue. We had concerns about transition of care when the FDA-approved drugs came out of shortage. We were hearing a lot of ballyhooing from Eli Lilly in particular about the fact that their drug was once again available. And so we had hoped to indicate to FDA that they really needed to manage this transition. Following that, well, and let me say one thing about FDA. I hope none of my comments today are meant to disparage FDA. These are hardworking folks. They are people of integrity. I am convinced that the right hand doesn't always know what the left hand's doing over there. And so our interactions are generally with the Office of Compounding Quality and Compliance, but there's also the Shortage Drug Division. And we've been communicating with both, and sometimes they agree with each other and sometimes they don't. We had urged in our messages to both of them that they either telegraph in advance that a resolution of shortage was coming so that we had some period to prepare patients, or to grant what is, and I don't want to get too technical with you guys, it's called enforcement discretion, but for FDA to basically say, we're going to grant a 60-day period after the drug comes out of shortage in which the pharmacy can continue to dispense the compounded version while the pharmacy demonstrates that it is working with the prescriber and the patient to transition the patient to the FDA-approved drug. Unfortunately, none of those things has happened. We wrote to FDA again last week, a day after the shortage was resolved, to ask again for that off-ramp, that 60-day period. We wrote again on Monday in partnership with the National Community Pharmacists Association to reiterate that request and to also raise some questions about compliance with FDA guidance, particularly as it relates to 503Bs and that 60-day tail that they have to continue to distribute drugs. I do think what is happening here, and this is me, this is, if you'll forgive an opinion on my part. I mean, traditionally, FDA looks at drug maker data as the statute allows. It makes a decision that supply is not sufficient to meet demand for a drug, and it places a drug in shortage, and it continues to monitor that data ongoing. And at some point, a day comes when FDA once again judges that supply is sufficient to meet the demand, and the drug comes off the shortage list. It affects some patients, but it's generally not a good deal, not a big deal. I believe FDA has failed to recognize that this shortage is not like other shortages. In terms of the number of patients affected, the number of patients who have been prescribed compounded therapies during this shortage, it is not on the same scale as shortages we've seen before. And in failing to recognize that, they unfortunately have created this anxiety and uncertainty that you've heard these patients talk about, that these pharmacists talk about, that their patients are experiencing.
Could I add to that?
Yeah, sure, John.
Okay, so I've been around for a long time, and I think I took the meaning of that question like, did we prepare our patients that this was inevitable? But I've been around with a lot of drug shortages, like two that are recent. It would be like lidocaine epinephrine, which again is an ubiquitous drug that doctors need for surgery, or Omnipeg, was another shortage that was unavailable, and we stepped in and helped with those at the time. But in the past, when FDA really took the drug off shortage, it's like the floodgates were just open. I mean, there was just no reason for anybody to turn to us because there was just so much supply back into the marketplace. But unfortunately, with this drug, that's not what we're seeing. So, I mean, I think our hope as compounding pharmacists was always that when it really went off a shortage, there just really wouldn't be a need for us to make it anymore. But in this case, that, in my opinion, is not what has occurred.
Allowed was for a 503B to distribute compounded drugs it had prepared directly to a 503A. And so we've had compounding pharmacies over the past year who are sourcing, and again, I don't want to, Jen, you mentioned that you guys, Jen's a 503A, traditional compounding pharmacy. She is sourcing GLP-1 drugs from a 503B and then dispensing them pursuant to a prescription. So FDA guidance, as Joseph has said, allows for a 60-day tail for 503Bs. Part of that is an incentive for 503Bs to actually step into the market when a drug is in shortage. Compliance with CGMP, the current good manufacturing practices, is expensive and time consuming. And so a 503B, drug goes into shortage today. Depending on the drug, it could be 3 to 9 months before a 503B can be up and running in producing that drug. And so they might look at it and say, well, I'm going to put all this upfront cost and time into it, and the day I begin to produce the drug comes out of shortage. I'm not taking that risk. And so what FDA allows is that 60-day tail so that 503Bs have a little more of an economic incentive to prepare the drug in the first place. They can continue to distribute after the drug comes out of shortage. But again, 503As don't have that tail. It's only Bs. And the difficulty right now is that 60-day window. If Jen is sourcing her GLP-1s from a 503B as a 503A that is now dispensing those drugs, does she still have the coverage that 60-day tail that the B had provides, because the B prepared the drug, but she's dispensing them? And that is abundantly unclear in FDA guidance. And so that's one of the questions, among some others, that we asked FDA this week and are awaiting their clarification. Joseph, that may be too long-winded for you. I hope it answers your question. Yeah.
Great. And Shelby, does that lead into your next question? The APC is pushing for an off-ramp period for 503As, exactly what I just mentioned. So the Outsourcing Facilities Association just sued the FDA to vacate the decision to remove Lilly's drugs from the shortages list. What kind of precedent is there for the FDA reversing the shortage decision or providing a longer transition period? And have there been other cases where the FDA did those things? Scott, Tennille, are y'all familiar with anything where they've done this before?
Well, drugs come on and off of the shortage list all the time. And I'm sure these pharmacists can tell you stories of when, a drug's been on the shortage list for 6 months and then it comes off for 3 months and it goes right back on. I suspect, frankly, we may begin to see that with the commercial Tirzepatide product just shortly. So it's not unusual to have drugs on and off. Pharmacist on the call, you got a better response to that question?
I'm happy to answer. Historically, drugs that go on the shortage list are mostly inexpensive generic medications because there's not as much of a financial incentive for drug manufacturers to make them. This has been unprecedented in my pharmacy career that a brand name blockbuster drug has gone on shortage almost immediately after its launch. I'm not aware of any precedent where FDA was sued when they removed something off the shortage list. This is all uncharted territory.
Did we touch base too on the fact that we really feel that, you know, FDA to remove the drug from the shortage list only takes into account what the manufacturer is telling them? Where, you know, when we were all up on the Hill, you know, last month talking to our representatives, we were trying to push for the fact that American, you know, ASHP, the American Society of Hospital Pharmacists, they're a lot of times the forefront of seeing shortages, or the wholesalers that we all buy from. So why isn't FDA, instead of just taking the word from the manufacturer, looking at, you know, what the hospitals are putting on their list, or looking at the data that we all are receiving from our wholesalers? So that was one of our asks when we were on the Hill, is to try to get FDA to kind of look at a broader picture of really what's happening in the country when it, you know, regards to these types of drug shortages.
Yeah, we are interested in expanding FDA's ability to draw from a broader range of sources. The current statute only allows them to consider data from drug makers. And we believe they ought to be able to pull from from health systems, from pharmacies. Certainly, these folks are on the front lines. If there is a shortage coming, they're going to be among the first to see it. And yet, FDA is somewhat bound by the law now that only allows them to draw from manufacturers. And so there is a legislative, I'll call it a proposal. It has not been introduced in the form of legislation, but I believe it will be shortly. That would allow that broadening. It would authorize FDA to draw from a broader pool. And interestingly, it would also extend that long tail that 503Bs have to 180 days. And both of those are not, they are not connected to GLP-1 compounding at all. They are connected to making sure that FDA can anticipate shortages of a range of drugs and begin to deploy 503Bs, 503As, drug makers, others to meet the shortage need well before the shortage occurs. And that's something that's really hard for them to do right now.
Your question, do you think the FDA was correct to make such a decision without at least posting a notice on the Federal Register? Scott, I'm going to want you to talk about this. Given the frustrations with the FDA's usual correspondence on this issue, should the agency have a better system in place for preparing pharmacies and patients for the immediate takeaway of permission for compounding? Is it okay? It's a long question. Is it okay that the FDA made this decision based on its own interpretation of what the law says regarding the drug shortages lists and compounding capabilities? And is the law clear enough that the agency is at least in the right moving forward on its own accord? Or was their interpretation of what they can do different enough from other stakeholders to interpret that maybe they shouldn't have?
Boy,
this is
there's a lot there.
Yeah. I can, let me know if you want me to send this to you as one.
Yeah, I'm reading it. Do I think that FDA was correct? I will tell you that what FDA did in this instance is generally what they've always done with drug shortages. They have taken the data provided them from the drug makers and made a calculation that supply was once again sufficient to meet demand. Now, that's the decision they made. I think you've heard here today that, at least anecdotally, the facts don't back that up. I believe that because this shortage is not like other shortages, FDA was indeed cavalier in not creating a different framework in which patients could be transitioned to new therapies here. Do I think that they should have put it in the Federal Register? As I understand the lawsuit from the Outsourcing Facilities Association against FDA, one of OFA's claims is that FDA should have adhered to notice and comment rulemaking in taking this drug off the drug shortage list. I confess I don't know how that would work. Typically, FDA makes these decisions based on the data. And, you know, on Monday, a drug comes onto the shortage list, and 3 Mondays later, it comes off. But again, this drug shortage is not like other shortages. And so what we've urged the agency to do, they already have the tools, they have the authority to recognize that every drug shortage is not equal. And when they have a drug shortage that affects a vast number of patients the way this one has, and FDA has known all along these patients are taking compounded therapies in this interim period, in this gap period when the drug makers can't manage their supply chains. When that is the case, FDA ought to have a different construct. They ought to have a platform that is portable, that includes an off-ramp for those patients.
So the next drug that we will be dealing with this with, we presume, is going to be semaglutide. And so I have
right. And God help us if FDA doesn't put something in place in time for that drug coming out of shortage, because as Jen and others have said, many more patients are on semaglutide than Tirzepatide. That is the fact with the FDA approved drug, and so we're pretty certain it's also the fact with the compounded versions. FDA needs to take seriously these concerns and build that framework right now for that moment that is coming. We don't know when, but it is coming. Semaglutide is going to come off the shortage list.